Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
We begin with a policy in China that has broad implications for the global tech sector. Beijing plans to expand its ban on Apple iPhone use in sensitive government departments and state-owned companies. Sources say several agencies are already instructing staff not to bring iPhones to work. The restrictions may broaden to more firms and organizations. Bloomberg chief tech correspondent Mark Gurman says this may just be a starting point for the Chinese government.
Is there something that's going to happen next in terms of the Chinese consumer being able to buy the Apple devices? Are there going to be limits there? Is the Chinese government going to begin clamping down on Apple's ability to sell, offer services, offer retail stores, offer Apple Care and support? So there clearly is a potential domino effect that I think investors are more afraid of rather than just lost sales to Chinese government workers.
Bloomberg's Mark Gurman says the blockade coincides with China's effort to reduce its reliance on American software. Apple is popular in China. It gets about a fifth of its revenue there. Checking Apple shares in the pre-market, they are down 2.6%.
Well, elsewhere in tech this morning, Nathan, Google is making a move aimed at protecting elections from artificial intelligence, and Bloomberg's Ed Baxter has the story.
Google is saying it will soon require all election advertisers to disclose when their messages have been altered or created by AI tools. The policy update, which applies starting mid-November, requires election advertisers across Google's platforms to alert viewers when their ads contain images, video, or audio from generative AI. They will have to use prominent language like "this audio is computer generated" or "this image does not depict real events." Google says it will improve transparency. In San Francisco, I'm Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
Okay, Ed, thank you. President Biden's headed to the G20 summit in India later this afternoon. He's aiming to seize on the absence of two key adversaries. Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping both opted to skip this year's gathering. President Biden will look to improve ties with countries like Brazil, South Africa, and India. They've sought closer ties with China and declined to take sides after Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Well, back here at home, Nathan, Texas is teetering on the edge of blackouts. The state's power grid operator ERCOT issued its first emergency declaration in over 2 years in response to shrinking power supplies. Spot power prices surged to more than $5,000 a megawatt hour, quadruple the cost of the average supply. ERCOT had to draw on reserves, and officials are urging customers to take conservation efforts. Texas is also warning medically fragile residents who need oxygen and similar aids to have backup plans in place.
In the nation's capital, Karen, the Justice Department plans to file new charges against President Biden's son, Hunter. Bloomberg's Nancy Lyons has that story.
An indictment of Hunter Biden is expected by the end of the month. That's according to documents filed in a Delaware court by special counsel David Weiss. The son of President Biden had agreed in principle to plead guilty to federal tax charges and enter a pretrial diversion agreement related to a gun charge. But that plea deal collapsed back in July. Prosecutors have not specified what charges they intend to file against the president's son. Nancy Lyons, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Nancy, thanks for the strike warning from the head of the United Auto Workers. Bloomberg's John Tucker joins us with the latest. Good morning, John.
Karen, President Shawn Fain says the union plans to go on strike against any Detroit automaker that hasn't reached a new agreement by the time contracts expire next week. The contracts with General Motors, Stellantis, and Ford will all expire just before midnight, September 14th. All in, the union's proposals would cost each of the big three automakers around $80 billion. The union will meet today with GM. Ford made an offer that includes 9% wage increases plus payments. Those talks are farthest along. An agreement with one automaker likely would set the template for the others. Live in New York, I'm John Tucker, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, John, thanks. We got more company news this morning. Sources tell Bloomberg the online grocery delivery startup Instacart is preparing to set a price range for its initial public offering. Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet has that.
The sources say the company is considering pricing its listing September 19th and then start trading the following day. They say the company's plans are fluid and the timeline could still change depending on market conditions. Instacart's listing could further energize an IPO market that has been warming in fits and starts. Semiconductor designer ARM Holdings set a price range for its IPO, which is expected to start trading in the biggest listing of the year as early as next week. In New York, Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Charlie, thanks to the broader economy now, the ISM U.S. Services Index rose to a 6-month high yesterday, but stocks declined amid speculation the strong data will keep rates higher for longer. Bloomberg macro strategist Mark Cudmore says evidence from yesterday's Beige Book suggests the Fed's rate hike path remains uncertain.
I thought the most important data yesterday was actually the Beige Book, which says backward looking, there's been some good stuff from the tourism and leisure sector, but the rest of the report was presenting warning signs about the consumer. I still believe that US softness is coming in the fourth quarter, and I think we're going to have a recession still starting around the end of the fourth quarter, maybe into early next year, but I still go for the end of this year.
And it's time now for a look at some of the other stories making news around the world. For that, we're joined by Bloomberg's Amy Morris. Amy, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. The Senate is going to start moving a package of government funding bills next week as Congress is racing to avoid a shutdown at the end of this month. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell says he appreciates the support that he's seen from President Biden.
He is supporting the effort, and I intend to continue to support it, and I hope the majority of my colleagues will feel the same way.
Now, the president and congressional leaders are focused on a passage of a stopgap funding measure to buy a little time while lawmakers iron out a full budget. Time is running short, though. The House is scheduled to meet for only 11 days before the government's fiscal year ends on September 30th. It was the first televised hearing in former President Trump's election interference case in Georgia. Fulton County Judge Scott McAfee laid out how these hearings involving the 19 co-defendants are going to move forward.
The plan would be to try to resolve as many of these issues as we can this week and to begin entering scheduling orders for the remaining defendants by either the end of this week or the early next week.
Now, Judge McAfee denied a motion for one of Trump's co-defendants, lawyer Kenneth Chesebro, to sever his case. He said he would later decide on whether lawyer Sidney Powell would sever hers. Prosecutors expect a joint trial to take 4 months. Former President Trump, meanwhile, says he's willing to take the witness stand in his own defense if his criminal cases do go to trial. He told a radio interview that he would absolutely look forward to testifying, but he also said he believes the cases are going to be dismissed. The former president has pleaded not guilty in 4 cases against him in New York, Georgia, Florida, and Washington, D.C. The oppressive heat still impacting millions of Americans and schools this week. In New England, a scramble to get air conditioning in classrooms. In Philadelphia, officials announcing schools that don't have air conditioning are going to be dismissed early for the rest of this week. Inglewood Health EMS Medical Director Dr. Barbara Schriebman says children are among the most at risk in the heat.
Children have a different physiology than adults, and the very young and the very old don't tolerate heat as well, especially when the humidity is higher.
More than 50 million people have been under heat alerts all week in the U.S., from Minnesota to Texas to Massachusetts. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Amy Morris. This is Bloomberg. Karen.
All right, Amy, thank you. Now we get a look at sports. And we bring in John Stashower. John, good morning.
Karen, it's opening night of the NFL. Not surprising, the Kansas City Chiefs are in the spotlight. They're the defending Super Bowl champions. They've won 7 straight AFC West titles. They've played in the AFC Championship game each of the last 5 years. It is surprising for the Detroit Lions to be featured, usually an NFL doormat, but they finished last season winning 8 of their last 10 games. Chiefs may not have their star tight end, Travis Kelce. He's questionable with a knee injury. The 49ers have gotten their star pass rusher, Nick Bosa, back in camp. He ended his 44-day holdout, agreed to a massive contract with the Niners, 5 years, $170 million. Bosa becomes the highest-paid defensive player in NFL history. At the U.S. Open, Aryna Sabalenka with another easy victory. She has yet to lose a set. She's advanced to the semifinals. She's been in the semis of all 4 Grand Slams this year. Coco Gauff has her semifinal match in New York today, and the men's semis will be played tomorrow. Daniil Medvedev advanced with a straight-set win over fellow Russian Andrei Rublev, and last night Carlos Alcaraz, the top-seeded defending champ, also won in straight sets. Baseball, Red Sox lost again at Tampa Bay 3-1. They've lost 15 of 16 at Tropicana Field. The Nationals rallied, scored ninth inning to beat the Mets 3-2. The Orioles' 5th straight win was 10-3 over the Angels. The Giants beaten by the Cubs 8-2. Rare win for the A's 5-2 over Toronto. John Stashower, Bloomberg Sports.
From coast to coast, from New York to San Francisco, Boston to Washington, D.C., nationwide on SiriusXM, the Bloomberg Business app, and Bloomberg.com. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning. I'm Nathan Hager. Apple's business in China is getting a lot more complicated. We've reported this week that the Chinese government is barring its workers from using their iPhones while they're on the job. Now, sources tell Bloomberg News that ban could be extended to state-owned businesses and other government-controlled enterprises. It's a move that could erode Apple's position in its biggest market outside the U.S. And for more on this, we're joined by Alex Webb, who covers the tech sector for us here on Bloomberg Radio. Alex, good morning. Why this push now to crack down on iPhones specifically in China? I mean, it wasn't that long ago that the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, was praising his company's relationship with Beijing.
Yeah, and of course, Apple employs millions of people, both directly and indirectly. Indirectly, I suppose, through Foxconn and other contract manufacturers in that part of the world. So there is a real kind of symbiotic relationship between the country and the company. But it sort of looks like we don't entirely know the rationale for this. It is based on sources reporting. It looks like there could be two reasons for it. First is a sort of tit for tat. We have seen obviously a crackdown on the supply of some important components into the Chinese market. We've also seen the US ban the use of TikTok in government agencies. This is on a state level at the moment, but it's the case in many states where TikTok is not allowed to operate on government networks. But at the same time, you also wonder, well, maybe they can justify it through security reasons, that actually in state-controlled or state agencies, we have started to see a pushback on the role of, for instance, consultants, and do they have an outsized role because of their proximity to, foreign groupings? There are many reasons why this might be the case. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's significant for Apple itself.
And it is interesting to think about it potentially as a national security rationale for China when we've heard U.S. government officials use that same rationale to try to limit China's access to cutting edge technology. How is China doing when it comes to its own development of some of that higher end technology despite U.S. sanctions?
So we did see some really interesting news in the past week or so that Huawei, which is the biggest Chinese technology hardware maker, has released a new phone called the Mate 60 Pro, which includes a chip that can operate very close to the cutting edge. It's built on the advanced 7 nanometer processor, which it seems, according to Bloomberg Teardown, has been manufactured by China's domestic chip-making giant Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corp, which is their equivalent of TSMC. It's not quite as big, but that's their effort to really onshore more of that core tech themselves. And many people didn't think that China had these capabilities yet. The fact that it seems they do is a turn up for the books. Now, there's a caveat to this. We don't know whether they're able to do it at scale, whether they can do it with the sort of they can make the economics work in the same way that TSMC can, but it shows they're a bit closer to the cutting edge than many had anticipated.
Well, if China does continue to get closer to the cutting edge and keep up this crackdown on Apple devices, what could it mean for Apple's position in the Chinese market?
Well, I mean, it clearly doesn't help, but you can just put it in a bit of context, right? So Apple has trailing 12-month revenue in the order of $73 billion in Greater China, which also includes Taiwan. But when we've looked at what has happened with, say, TikTok in the US and the crackdown on using that in government agencies, it doesn't really seem to have had any meaningful impact on TikTok's trajectory. So, yes, these government-controlled companies, the likes of PetroChina, they do employ millions of people. Let's wait and see when we get to earnings calls to see if that actually has any meaningful impact. If you judge it by the TikTok experience, the implication would be it may not be significant.
Our last minute, we're waiting and seeing for Apple's next product launch as well. I think it's coming up next week, right? Does that put more pressure on Apple to deliver when it comes to what's coming next?
look, there's always pressure on Apple in terms of what comes next. The thing they have managed to do, we are going to see new. We're going to see new iPhones likely next week, and probably a new Apple Watch as well. But the big story with Apple is how they have managed to diversify away from the hardware into services, which not only is higher margin, but it also ties people more tightly to their hardware. And that is why people still keep buying these things, even without major upgrades.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Today, your morning brief on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed at 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 106.1 in Boston, and Bloomberg 960 in San Francisco.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, Sirius XM Channel 119, the iHeartRadio app, and on Bloomberg.com. I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.